Good evening, or good day, depending on what time you are watching this. I'm David Faulkner, General Manager of Property Brokers Property Management, and with me today is Professor Graham Squires from the Property Knowledge, also at Lincoln University. Graham, what are you doing here at Lincoln? So you've been here for what, a couple of years now, have you?
Chalked up about 14 months now,
14
over
months.
a year. So I settled in as formerly Master University. Here I'm the director of the Bachelor of Land and Property Management. So this is the largest undergraduate program on campus. We do rural valuations, do urban valuations, we do property management, people go into investment, finance, all sorts of properties. So it's a course that's been going since the 1970s,
yeah,
well ingrained, and yeah, so it's nice to lead the charge here. So, you know, as part of my job, I do research and do teaching. I teach on the property management course, on the property development course, and our Property 101 Introduction to Property course.
Yeah,
we're about 200 students on that, so they're keeping me busy. Do lots of research, tend to research on housing, property, and do bits of consultancy. And you know, the genesis of this report's formed from that research.
Okay. So what we're going to do, we're going to share the screen, and we're going to make sure that we'll just make sure we get on the right screen first. And we'll get across, and then we can. So just bear with me. Okay, so property knowledge, you know, talk to me about property knowledge in more depth.
Yeah.
So what is this about? What are you doing here with the property knowledge?
So I think there's certainly a need for independent, robust, insightful research that helps organisations. We know that organisations have got their internal research in terms of an operational sense, but I think there's a real need to have research that's, you know, informed and connected and can see the sort of the bigger picture and connect to sort of academic work as well. So the idea is for property knowledge to work with companies like property brokers, and sort of add value and add a value proposition, which is essentially adding a greater intelligence and foresight to what you do, so that you'll have a better competitive advantage to other companies in the field, I guess.
So from our perspective as well, it also gives credibility to the research that we do. That we've got somebody who's a professor, they're an academic, they're in a university, they're well known, and you're not going to put your name to, you know, anything. It's got to be verified as to what we do, and the research that we do together. It's the business meets academia to a degree.
Indeed, and what I like about what we do is the tailoring. So we get together and think about what's the hot topic and what's important for your company. Like, for example, this particular report, population migration is the key driver that needs to be talked about and looked at in an independent and apolitical way, if we can do that.
Well, it's a fascinating time around immigration, isn't it, at the moment? Because we seem to be having an influx of people coming into the country, and it started to make the news around about October last year around net migration. Now, obviously, we've had COVID has gone, so we're overcoming the hangover of that. They've probably opened the borders to get people in to fill jobs which were left by whether it's backpackers or whoever who've left the country. We've still seen a lot of New Zealanders leave the country and go across the ditch. Talk to us about what's happening with immigration.
Yeah, well, more broadly, as you can sort of see with that diagram, you can see the COVID blip, and it sort of tends to mirror what's happening with the housing market. You see the dip and the real sharp rise, and a market correction, but a market correction that's starting to exceed where it was previously. If you followed that line where the COVID was and see how it's sort of starting to, you know, it's starting to accelerate. So I think that's an interesting component here. And we're seeing the net figure is basically the grey line.
Yes.
That's 135,000 new net migrants into New Zealand. So that's significant. And the new figures beyond this report, recent released, is seeing a trend that goes beyond that number. So there's a record amount of net migration coming. So this is not just a COVID anomaly. This is a New Zealand, whether it's a strategy or it's just the reality of the numbers that are being tracked that we can see and feeding through. And I think this is important in the big picture context, given that a lot of the conversations we've been covering for, I mean, I've been in New Zealand 7 years, and a lot of it's been about interest rates, then it was about inflation. And I think, well, with those sorts of macroeconomic considerations, there's not a great deal. Everyone's sort of trying to second guess when interest rates are going to change, and everyone's talking about always inflation under control. But population as a driver, economists would talk about, well, what drives demand, and population is one of those factors. So here, this is, to my mind, very important to the rental consideration, which is where we come in, I guess. And why it's important to rents with migration is you can make that argument that of those 135,000 new net migrants, they're not all going to be buying houses.
No.
There's going to be a significant proportion who are going to be renting. It's a sort of a first point of call, whether you're going to be buying in the future, whether you're looking to get in permanent residency, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think it does have this pressure on the rental stock.
Well, from my own experience, and I mean, obviously, from the UK as well, from not too far away from where I'm from in the UK, we came here in 2001. Yeah. We rented for the first year because, first of all, you want to find out, is this place for us before you make that big commitment to go and buy a property. And back then in 2001, it was a hell of a lot easier to buy a property than what it is today. So of this 132,000, you're going to say roughly at least 90 to 95% of these people would fall into the rental market, or could it be that they're going to go and move in with family members? What do you have any idea on how many of these, or is it just pure speculation?
Can't put a number on it, but it's just, I think that intuitively speaking, your anecdote, my experience, the majority of people are going to be renting, and I say the majority of people, it's not going to be half and half. I would put a strong intuition that it's going to be a large proportion who are going to be renting to start with, because what we see in the media is it's immigration. It's going to be high net worth individuals buying multi-million-dollar properties, but I think the reality is a little bit more grounded to this, and I think there's a rental conversation that needs to be had. And I think this is going to be my next point really, is if we move into the who, I mean, the left-hand screen sort of builds up to showing what that net migration is.
So 127,000 net migration, 170, nearly 172,000 people have decided to make New Zealand home. However, there's a fair chunk of Kiwis which have probably decided they're going to go. Most of them, you'd assume, are going to Australia for better income, better prospects.
Well, it's interesting, but before we get into the Aussie question, I think when you start to look at, where are the net immigration coming from, and the first reaction from media would be China, but here we see India. Significant amount of 44,000 there.
So it's not the typical Western, not your trip, the colonial and coming over from, say, the Commonwealth and places like that. It's more now. Well, India is in the Commonwealth, isn't it? But
indeed. You look at it's just for those who can't see, it's India, Philippines, China, sort of the headline figures there. I mean, if you look at the UK down here and Australia, sort of further down the sort of the category, South Africa sort of in the middle, some Pacific Islanders sitting in the middle, but so we are seeing a sort of a significant rest of the world is probably the terminology that Stats New Zealand would use, and that are playing a part in people who are coming to New Zealand and making it their home. The big orange line to your right is in New Zealand going the other way. So this is where the conversation about Australia starts to fit in.
I mean, I'm a bit of a cricket fan, and looking at that graph is good news for New Zealand cricket. If you've got all these immigrants coming in from India, for next generations and whatever it may be. So,
England cricket.
Well, anyway, so what are the trends we've got here on migration? What have we got on these? So we got on page 8 and page 9, 1D, 1E.
Monthly trend. So we can roughly sort of see this as that sort of sharp upwards trend, particularly post COVID. But on the right is the sort of the Australian question, and I've got some what we're seeing here in terms of figures of New Zealanders. We're seeing a net migration to Australia, about 45,000 net. That's the sort of figures we're looking at. Obviously, we're getting about 20,000 Aussies coming this way, but we're getting the 60,000.
So we've actually got 20,000 Australians coming into New Zealand.
We start to look at some of these figures here. We're getting down to the details. So the net migration figures is the grey line. So we're sort of minus.
So we've actually got a 60,000 going to Aussie and 20,000 coming in from Aussie. Are they Kiwis, or do you know that? Or is it just, I mean, again,
this would be New Zealand citizens. Is that picked up in the data?
Right. Interesting. Right.
So,
Okay. Right. So what have we got here on?
Then so on sort of the regional question. So you've got that sort of international picture. We're sort of looking at sort of key countries, your India, Philippines, China. Then we're talking about the Australian question. Okay, we're sort of saying that it's a net amount of New Zealanders going across the ditch. And now here we sort of think, well, what's this mean for the regionally in terms of how things are changing and what sorts of movements we start to see. And essentially, the big picture stuff here is Auckland with over 35,000 people in 2023, sort of increase.
Yeah.
Whereas previously it was minus 21,000.
Yeah, so a lot of people leaving because of COVID.
Yeah.
Then they've all coming in. They're all moving, or a good chunk of them. Saying that, Auckland does make up a third of New Zealand, doesn't it, in terms of population?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
So you see that significant pressure there.
So in proportion, really, to the population of Auckland in relation to, that's about half the cost, really, would you say? They're not all going into Auckland. A big chunk of them are going to go into. What about the provinces? That's what property brokers are all about. We work in the provinces.
Yeah.
Is this going to have an impact around provincial New Zealand? We can see, looking at this graph, it's sporadic.
Yeah, yes, indeed. If you look on the right-hand side, this is all, the ones in orange is 2023. So you see on the ones in orange are all shifting positive. And you see the big lines is that big orange line, which is the Auckland stuff. The other bits of real interest, I mean, we're standing in Canterbury.
Yep.
So you can see that massive orange line there, more so than Wellington. And interestingly, Otago region, which obviously includes central Otago lakes as well. So sort of, Queenstown.
Bay of Plenty, Waikato have a big boomers there.
Exactly, yeah. And it tends to be sort of Waikato's. Sometimes it's a bit of overspill from Auckland and people sort of changing work patterns and being able to sort of live in Waikato, cheaper houses, all that sort of stuff. But yeah, and Bay of Plenty, there's always a conversation there, isn't it, about second homes and sort of being part of the Golden Triangle, really, Tauranga, Hamilton, Auckland. So yeah, there's a bit of a cluster in there that you tend to find in that sort of north of the North Island. But I think the interesting bit is that Canterbury region is sort of taking big leaps in terms of migration and putting pressures on rents.
So, I mean, my understanding, when I've done some studies and a little bit of research, I don't know if you'd know this, but would you have any idea what the average, how many people are living in a property? Is it about 2.2 or 2.3? Is there any data what you could tell? Because if you go off that summarization, if you've got a net 120, 130,000 people moving in, you've probably got to divide that by the number of, say, average people living in a property, let's say 3 as an example, and that gives you an estimation on how many houses that we're going to need.
Yeah.
So we're probably looking at this, probably about 40,000, 50,000 rental properties light on what we need. Would that be a fair guess?
I think is, I mean, obviously this data is not looking into the specific demographics of households, but there's certainly a really interesting study that could be done looking at houses of multiple occupation as different to single family homes, because the rental properties, it tends to be people trying to sort of maximize the property.
So can you explain in the UK they're known as a HMO, house of multiple occupants. Can you explain to some of our viewers may not be familiar with that concept? Are you talking like a boarding house here or what?
Yeah. As particularly, I think, in my knowledge of Christchurch is, there was a big push post-earthquake to get engineers, get key workers, people who can build the city back. So there's a ready interest for properties that could house multiple occupants as workers. So and you see a lot of the development changes of properties being sort of split and used in that way.
Right.
But obviously the data, we can't delve into that too much, but I see how that logic flows through.
Okay. Just for people who are looking at this, and I know you probably can't see it that well, a little error in our report. We've got, if you're looking in 1F and come down to the second bottom, you probably calculate it, but the black line is covering it. That's Auckland. So you can see there from migration from 2022, 2021 is down in Auckland. And then it's got this big spike, and that obviously we're going to see a bit of a push on rents because rents have been quite static in Auckland recently. Yeah. Now we're going to see it go the other way by all accounts.
Definitely. And if we start to move on to the next bit, we'll start to see so this is all starting to look at how rents connect to migration. So, we see that figures, we see those sorts of regional trends, that sort of Auckland shift, the shift in terms of Canterbury. Here we're starting to feed in conversations around rental stock and prices. So this is where we look at the sort of bond information.
Yep.
This is the controversial, is it official, unofficial terms of rents? So the 410,000 active bonds in New Zealand, and how we can carve that up and think about, well, what, given that amount of stock that's active, how much pressure is being put from different migratory patterns.
So just
move on to that.
So just explain about the 410,000 bonds, because I hear, and this is what you keep hearing from government, there's about 600,000 rental properties in New Zealand, yet there's only, if I go onto the bond data, there's 410,000 bonds. Do you have any idea why there's a discrepancy on the number of bonds compared to the number of rental properties, or are people just speculating on actually how many rental properties there are?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you could pick that sort of information from sort of trade me type sort of information, or if people haven't put a bond forward, if they're doing it privately, it's just unofficial data. So I mean, this is all going through, what people register with the government, so people hold bonds. So you're not going to know that gap. It's like, it's missing data, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, you've quoted figures that, quite significant, and probably somewhere in the middle. But there's certainly going to be properties that are going to be missed. Because this Joe Bloggs is going to be renting out their property and not lodging it as a bond.
Okay, so I'm just looking at the 2B here, and there's obviously a trend, quite a significant trend really on rents when you're looking at the different regions. If we look on the far left, then you can see the all rents have been gone to pretty static from 21 to 22. Quite a bit of a spike there, going upwards of $600 for all of New Zealand.
Indeed, we see that pressure. But I think what I find interesting in terms of pressure, I think it's pressure on stock is the conversation. You see these big bars on the left in terms of Auckland. We talked about Canterbury. We talked about Wellington, and price. If you look across those figures, rents, relatively speaking, are quite similar. I know people in Auckland would argue, well, it's nothing like Southland, but when you compare what you pay for rents and the amount of stock, there's a certain supply, demand, quantity, price conversation.
I can tell you now, Graham, that you're making a really good point here, because we research this all the time. We're looking at what is happening with rents, and there's very, very little difference now around the provinces. That the rents are kind of, there's a few anomalies. For example, like Bear Plenty, that's high rents. Napier is higher rents. Kapiti Coast is higher rents. You exclude those regions, a lot of them are generally the same. The big one which sticks out, and it sticks out on this graph, is the West Coast, where the rents are considerably lower. And then the next one would be Southland as well. But everywhere else, it's pretty much consistent.
So it comes down to a stock conversation, because I think when you add up what you pay in rent in Auckland, for instance, at around 30 grand a year, with those averages, for a similar thing on the West Coast, you're going to be paying 20,000, so 10 grand. And the commercial opportunities in cities compared to major cities compared to more provincial towns and cities, the pressure's on the stock, isn't it? And I think that's what we tried to bring out in these final tables. So what we got here is looking at two significant things. So looking at how stock has some sort of relationship with migration. And I suppose we won't get down into the weeds, but the key bits are looking at the yellow column and the green column. And what we're seeing here is the yellow column 2022, green 2023. And this, we're looking at a ratio of stock to migration. And what you can see here is those higher values. You'll see Wellington region at 9%. And that means that there's a significant amount of migration pressure on stock. Does that make sense? So for Wellington, interestingly, there is a lot of talk of Wellington being less of a choice than, say, Auckland, Canterbury at the moment. We see that with our student numbers. However, if you look at the numbers that are coming in, a shift from minus 3,000 to 5,200, we're seeing that real sort of shift.
That's a huge swing, isn't it?
So I think, and if we made that sort of loose argument earlier that the majority of people who net immigration are renting, that's there's going to be that pressure on the stock. So I think that's a nice sort of way of looking at ratios and where sort of pressured regions are.
I mean, you can see that just looking at Auckland, where you've got that net migration in 2022 of negative 24,200, and then you've got it goes 2023 positive 36,700. So that's an increase of over 50,000. Yet the bonds have only increased by 9,000. So you do the numbers, divide the number of people, so 50,000 plus,
Yeah.
by the increase of bonds, which is 9,000.
Yeah.
So that means you're going to have 5 and a bit people living in each property to make it. So there is direct evidence that we do not have enough rental stock. I mean, hard to predict because we've seen rental inflation increase significantly around the provinces, Graham, with the stock that we manage. There's other reasons. We're seeing the poorer stock go off and sell. Better stock is coming in, so that naturally will increase rents. But what impact do you think that will we still continue to see rents increase due to inflation, or do we get to a tipping point where people can only afford so much? What do you think? I know it's a difficult question, particularly for an academic to answer.
I'll try to give politicians answer, but I think it is a fair question. I think, well, if you look internationally, rents have gone up universally in Western developed nations.
Yeah.
So it's not like New Zealand's sort of unique in this regard. So I don't think we're only making any sort of spurious remarks by saying that it has gone up and it's going to continue to go on. I mean, there's the pressures are all around. There's going to be landlords are probably going to be more pressured to put up rents because the interest rates they're not going to fall instantaneously. It's pretty much the feel that's going on. Inflation's there. Yes, it's sort of starting to taper a bit, but it's still there. But with this, landlords are always going to be pressured to increase, and for the majority of people, private rents is the option. So wherever you are on the curve. So I think there's going to be the pressure's there, and personally, I can't see it in the sort of the next year or two that rents are going to.
Because landlords are still going to have significant tax bills, aren't they? With the interest deductibility, it's been phased out, but we're still going to have that impact for a couple of years with immigration. So the landlords are probably going to want to try and get as much money as they can to cover the outgoings.
Yeah, and I think there's pressure on the housing market as well. It's that interrelationship between the rental price market and the housing price market.
Yeah.
And if part of this is to try and stimulate the housing market because interest rates, inflation can't be the big lever, there's still going to be it might sort of keep the housing market ticking along, but we're seeing a bigger increase in immigration numbers, and if we go with that line of reasoning that the vast majority are going to be renting, there's pressure on rental stock.
And they will eventually flow through though to first home buyers, you would think, in New Zealand at some point. A good percentage of them would.
Yeah, people can have the means to do it, and whether they can legally do it, depending on the sort of the laws of purchasing. But it's going to be I suppose it's all depends on how the housing prices do and the ability for people to get deposits. People are renting. There's always the imputed rent. People can't save to get deposits. So
I mean, the
interrelationship of the two markets is important.
The graph on the left is interesting just to look at by looking at the amounts of red in 2022, and there's absolutely no red at all in the green in 2023. Every region has had a net migration growth.
Yeah, exactly. That's what's pushing it, and I think that's why. Such an interesting point of conversation, and this similarly is sort of starting to look. I mean, this is looking at prices. Looking at prices rather than volume and stock. And it's the same story again. You're looking in 2022 is a mixed bag of negative and positive figures, but 2023 it's all driven by migration, and big scheme rent. It's going up, but comparative to population, we're seeing significant.
I mean, where we are, Canterbury, I've always argued Canterbury seems to have got it right, and particularly where Lincoln University is based in the Selwyn district. I did an article on it, not this current month, but the previous month, and you can see the amount of building consent and the growth in bonds, and the rents have basically stabilised because they've been able to keep that supply, keep going. I look at Gisborne. Look at Gisborne. In 2022, it's $500. I remember not so long ago, it'd be about $220 a week in Gisborne. Now it's $550. It's more than Canterbury.
You look at the commercial and employment opportunities. It's certainly going to affect different regions in different ways, and but quite significantly in different ways. It's very telling. And with these numbers on the right in green are sort of the lower numbers mean they've got the most pressure. and Auckland's the one with big pressure. I think Otago, interestingly, but I would imagine that's the sort of Queenstown. If you talk about rental problems,
there's a lot going.
Queenstown's always the poster child for that.
Yeah, but there's a lot. There is, but I know there's a lot going on in Dunedin as a city itself at the moment. There's a lot of development going on in there. There's money being put into the new hospital. They can't get enough plumbers and aspects such as that. I look at that graph, and the thing that sticks out for me is, I mean, if I'm an investor, and I don't want to go out and say, or go and do this. This is just my opinion. It's not an opinion of the company. But I look at the West Coast, and I think rents are below where they probably should be in comparison to the rest of New Zealand. And there's room there for rents. I could, if I'm going to make a prediction, I'd say I can see West Coast rents increasing to catch up with the rest of the provinces. Okay.
It's a question of employment as well, isn't it? So I suppose it'd be quite interesting to sort of take this forward and look at how the sort of employment consideration sits within this, because obviously geography matters, and if you're near a commercial centre or a major city, it might have some sort of overspill effect.
Can you explain the graph on the right, please, in terms of, so the blue is net migration and rent pricing. What is it? Is a correlation between migration and price?
Yeah, so these are basically these yellow and green but graphed.
Yeah. So
we're seeing all the oranges are all the 2023 figures. So the highest numbers where there's less pressure, and where it's smaller, there's more pressure.
Yeah.
So that's sort of basically pictorially showing what we just talked about in terms of Auckland.
Yeah.
Your West Coast argument is that's got the biggest variance.
Yeah.
In statistical terms.
Yeah.
So if the market is going to tighten, it's going to have more elasticity to be able to do that. So
that's us. All right. So that's been bloody interesting, Graham. I mean, fascinating stuff.
I've enjoyed doing it, and I think it's just really opened another point of conversation outside of the media with what I'm trying to do with the property knowledge.
Yeah.
Sort of have nice informed work that's going to have use to companies, but also be robust and be tailored to what's happening now.
So if people want to download the report, I'll put a link in the chat for our website. So if people want to download it, we can get it from that. They can also go onto your website. Do you want to give a bit of a plug for your website?
Yeah. So just Google the property knowledge, propertyknowledge.co.nz. Happy to help and talk through the report. The report will be on my website, be on your website.
Yep.
Get in touch.
Okay. All right. Thank you, guys. I hope you found that informative. Thank you, Professor, for sharing your time and your research. It adds value to what we do, and it certainly helps us as well as a company. And if you get any questions, you just fire away. You can email me, david.faulkner@pb.co.nz. And Graham, what's the best way that they can get hold of you if they want to get hold of you?
My email address at the university is on the top of my head, graham.squires@lincoln.ac.nz.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Graham.
No
Cheers.
worries.
Good evening, guys, and thanks for tuning in.